Welcome back to Horror History, where we take you on deep dives into the sinister corners of the past. I'm your host, Vigilante, and today we're heading into the American frontier, a time of opportunity, grit, and danger. The Kansas plains were a blank slate for settlers. But beneath the promise of new beginnings lurked unimaginable horrors. Among the hardworking families and hopeful pioneers, one group stood out. Not for their contribution to the land, but for the bodies they buried underneath it. This is the story of the Bloody Benders, America's first serial-killing family. It's a story of manipulation, murder, and mystery. Over the course of this episode, we'll peel back the layers of their crimes, exploring their twisted motivations, and dig into the enduring enigma of their fate. So grab a seat at the dining table. Just don't sit with your back to the curtain. In the early 1870s, Kansas was part of the American frontier, a land of opportunity and isolation. With the passage of the Homestead Act in 1862, settlers were encouraged to claim 160 acres of land, build a home, and farm it. In exchange, they could own the property after 5 years. For many families, this promise of owning land offered a fresh start. A chance to escape the crowded, industrial cities of the East or the political turmoil in Europe. Among the thousands who came to Kansas were the Benders, who arrived in Lubbock County in 1870. The Benders were of German descent, and their origins were shrouded in mystery even at the time. Some accounts suggest they immigrated directly from Europe, while others claim they had been living somewhere else in the United States before arriving in Kansas. Their motives for moving west, however, would later seem far darker than those of the average homesteader. The family consisted of 4 members, each more unsettling than the last. John Bender, Sr., known as Pa, was a towering, gruff man in his 60s. He spoke little English, relying instead on guttural German phrases, and was known for his menacing demeanor. Locals described him as unapproachable and intimidating, a man who seemed to prefer the company of his axe to his neighbors. Elvira Bender, or Ma, was equally unpleasant. At around 55 years old, she was rumored to be a spiritualist, but her reputation leaned more towards that of a witch. Locals avoided her sharp tongue and cold, piercing eyes. Some whispered that she wasn't even John Sir's wife, but his sister, though this remains unverified. Their son, John Jr., was a tall, awkward man in his 20s, often described as strange or simple-minded. He had an unsettling laugh that he employed at inappropriate times, which only added to the family's peculiar reputation. Despite his odd behavior, he was seen working tirelessly alongside his father, reinforcing the family's image as hardworking settlers. Finally, there was Kate Bender, the youngest and by far the most enigmatic. In her early 20s, Kate was the face of the family's public dealings. She was strikingly attractive, with a charm and wit that made her a favorite among those who met her. Unlike her family members, Kate embraced the spotlight. She advertised herself as a healer and a spiritualist, claiming she could cure illnesses and commune with the dead. Her charisma drew people to the Bender homestead for miles around, travelers seeking guidance, settlers looking for comfort, and even the skeptical came to see the beautiful psychic who promised to unlock the mysteries of the universe. But what they didn't know was that Kate's charm was a tool, a weapon wielded with deadly precision to draw victims into the family's trap. When settlers arrived in Lubbock County, they built homes that were functional, often consisting of a single room that served multiple purposes. The Bender's cabin followed this model, but with a sinister twist. The one-room cabin was divided by a heavy canvas curtain. The front portion served as a store and inn, offering basic goods like tobacco, coffee, and tools, as well as lodging for weary travelers. This was where Kate worked her magic, entertaining visitors with her charm and spiritual insights. Behind the curtain lay the family's private quarters, a small area with crude bedding and personal items. But the most chilling feature of the home wasn't visible at first glance. Beneath the dining table, placed conspicuously close to the curtain, was a trap door leading to a cellar. The cellar itself was a dark, foul-smelling pit, roughly dug and lined with dirt. This small, unassuming feature of the home would later be revealed as a dumping ground for the family's victims, stained with blood and soaked in horror. The setup of the house was anything but random. Guests were always seated at the dining table with their backs to the curtain. This seemingly innocent arrangement ensured that when the family struck, the victims had no time to react. Every detail of the home's layout was designed to facilitate their gruesome enterprise. On the surface, the Benders appeared to be an ordinary family of settlers, but their true nature was far from normal. Each member of the family played a specific role in their murderous scheme. Kate, with her beauty and charm, acted as the bait. Her psychic readings and healing services drew victims to the property, and her flirtatious nature often disarmed even the most cautious travelers. Her mother, Elvira, provided an aura of menace that discouraged anyone from probing too deeply into the family's affairs. John Jr. and John Sir handled the physical labor. They were the muscle behind the operation, responsible for digging graves, disposing of bodies, and carrying out the murders themselves. John Sir's axe, often seen in his hand as he worked the fields, would later take on a far more sinister connotation. Together, the family created a chilling symphony of manipulation and violence. Their remote location on the Osage Trail, a vital route for pioneers and traders, ensured a steady stream of victims. Travelers in search of shelter and companionship found only death waiting for them at the Bender home. But the family's cruelty didn't stop at murder. The victims' belongings were stripped, their bodies desecrated, and their stories erased from the annals of frontier life. For years, the Benders operated without detection, their home a silent witness to countless atrocities. The isolation prairie was their stage, and the Bender family played their roles with horrifying precision. The Benders' method of murder was chilling in its simplicity, efficiency, and cold-blooded calculation. Every element of their scheme seemed designed to minimize effort and maximize the horror. Guests who stopped at the Bender Inn were greeted warmly, particularly by Kate, whose charm and beauty disarmed even the wariest traveler. Once inside, guests were offered food and a place to rest. The dining table was always positioned against the canvas curtain, a placement that seemed inconsequential to the weary traveler but was critical to the family's deadly operation. With their backs to the curtain, the victims were completely vulnerable. As the guests settled in, one of the male Benders, either John Sir or John Jr., would position themselves behind the curtain armed with a heavy hammer. With a swift, brutal strike to the back of the skull, the victim would be injured or killed instantly. This method was quiet enough to avoid alarming anyone who might be nearby. But the Benders weren't satisfied with merely knocking their victims unconscious. To ensure complete silence and remove any chance of survival, another family member, usually Elvira or Kate, would step in to split the victim's throat. The gruesome act was quick and merciless, leaving no chance for the victim to fight back or cry out. The body was then disposed of with chilling efficiency. The Benders had installed a trapdoor beneath the dining table which led to a dark, foul-smelling cellar. Once the victim was killed, their body was dropped through the trapdoor into this pit, where it was stripped of valuables. Any money, jewelry, or possessions were taken, often the primary motive behind the killings. The final step in the macabre process involved the family's orchard. The bodies were dragged from the cellar, often under the cover of darkness, and buried in shallow graves among the trees. The Benders' choice of burial site was as calculated as every other part of their operation. The orchard's appearance and location naturally discouraged investigation. What made their crimes all the more chilling was the sheer number of victims. Located along the Osage Trail, a major route for settlers, traders, and pioneers, the Benders' property was perfectly positioned to attract a steady stream of travelers. Many of these individuals were passing through alone or in small groups, making their disappearances easy to overlook. For years, this assembly line of death operated undetected, the family's carefully coordinated actions enabling them to evade suspicion. The homestead, with its warm fire and charming hostess, seemed a sanctuary in the vast, lonely Casis prairie, but for those who entered it, became a one-way ticket to a violent, unmarked grave. By 1871, whispers of trouble along the Osage Trail had begun to circulate. Travelers and settlers alike noticed an unsettling pattern. People who had passed through the area seemed to vanish without a trace. At first, these disappearances were attributed to the dangers of frontier life. Bandits, wild animals, and harsh weather were all plausible explanations. But as the years went on, the frequency of these accidents became too significant to ignore. Missing persons reports began piling up, often involving individuals who had last been seen heading towards the Bender property. The local community grew uneasy. Labette County was a close-knit area, and the idea that something or someone was preying on travelers cast a shadow over daily life. Still, the lack of concrete evidence made it difficult to act. The Bender family, for their part, maintained an air of normalcy. They kept up appearances, tending their land and interacting with neighbors in a way that seemed ordinary, if somewhat standoffish. However, for some, the Bender homestead carried an undeniable air of foreboding. Visitors who stopped at the inn often described feeling uneasy, as though they were being watched. Others noted the strange behavior of the family, particularly Elvira's hostility and John Jr.'s unsettling laugh. These observations, while unsettling, were not enough to warrant investigation. It wasn't until the disappearance of a prominent figure that the growing suspicion would finally reach a breaking point. In 1873, the Benders' carefully constructed facade began to crumble. The catalyst was the disappearance of Dr. William York, a well-known physician from Independence, Kansas. Dr. York had recently completed a journey to Fort Scott, where he had been checking on a missing friend and patient. On his return trip, he stopped at several homesteads along the Osage Trail, including the Bender property. When he failed to arrive home, his family immediately raised the alarm. Unlike many of the Benders' previous victims, Dr. York had influential connections. His brother, Colonel Ed York, was a Civil War veteran and a prominent figure in Kansas. Another brother was a state senator, determined to find answers. Colonel York organized a search party and began retracing Dr. York's steps along the trail. The search party visited the Bender homestead, where they were met with the family's usual mix of charm and hostility. Kate, as always, was the family's spokesperson, insisting that they knew nothing of Dr. York's whereabouts. The family even suggested that bandits or Native Americans might have been responsible for his disappearance. A convenient scapegoat often used in frontier disputes. But Colonel York was not easily convinced. He noticed inconsistencies in the family's story, and was particularly unsettled by Elvira's hostile demeanor. Despite his suspicions, he lacked definitive proof, and had no legal grounds to accuse the Benders outright. The pressure on the family was mounting, however. The community was growing increasingly suspicious, and the Benders could sense that their time was running out. It wasn't long before the family vanished, leaving behind only their empty cabin and the horrifying secrets buried beneath it. When neighbors entered the abandoned cabin, they found bloodstains on the floorboards and the infamous trapdoor leading to the cellar. The stench of decay was overwhelming, and the cellar walls were stained with blood. Outside, the true horror was revealed. The Benders had used their orchard as a graveyard. Shallow graves held at least a dozen bodies, including Dr. York. Some of the victims had been mutilated, suggesting a sadistic element to their crimes. the community's outrage turned to action as a posse formed to track the family. But they had a head start. The Benders seemed to have disappeared into thin air. Over the years, theories about the Benders' fate have ranged from plausible to fantastical. Some believe they fled west, possibly changing their identities. Others claim they were caught by vigilantes who exacted justice in secret. Reports of their capture or deaths often turned out to be false or unsubstantiated. Greed is the most obvious motive, as many victims were robbed. However, some speculate that the murders had ritualistic undertones, particularly given Kate's spiritualistic practices. The truth may never be known. The Bloody Benders story has become a part of American folklore, inspiring countless books, films, and even legends about haunted orchards. Their crimes remain a chilling reminder of how evil can lurk behind the most ordinary facades. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Horror History. The story of the Bloody Benders is as chilling today as it was over 150 years ago, a haunting reminder of the dangers that can hide in plain sight. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review, subscribe, and share the podcast. Until then, stay curious, stay cautious, and as always, stay safe. Peace.